They say it only takes a few moments for life to turn upside down. Aaliyah Jackson, a bright and confident black teenager, never expected her dream summer trip would become an explosive viral scandal. Moments after she was wrongfully kicked off a commercial flight with no apologies, no explanations, her father's sleek private jet roared onto the tarmac. And the crew who misjudged her. They found themselves at the center of an uproar that would threaten their careers. What began as a routine journey morphed into a suspense-filled saga riddled with prejudice, power, and payback. This is the story of one fateful flight that no one will ever forget. Aaliyah Jackson was 15 the first time she stepped onto an airplane. That trip from her hometown of Chicago to Orlando, Florida, had changed her life. She vividly remembered how the clouds looked fluffy and surreal through the plane window. She remembered the giddy feeling of being above the world, safe and fearless, ever since she had loved flying. Her father, Franklin Jackson, was an influential name in the tech startup scene, known for his calm demeanor and visionary leadership. A self-made millionaire, he had grown up with nothing and risen to the top through sheer grit. Aaliyah was his world, his only child, his princess, and the one he had sworn to protect. Their family lived in a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Chicago, nestled behind tall iron gates that gave them privacy. Despite their wealth, Aaliyah was determined to experience life on her own terms. She joined after-school clubs, volunteered at local community centers, and insisted on traveling in coach whenever they flew commercial. She wanted to remain grounded, humble in the face of her father's success. That summer, she decided to use some of her savings and allowance to visit her cousin Tiana in Atlanta. She booked her own ticket on a modest seat for a domestic flight departing from O'Hare International Airport. The trip was an impromptu plan. Tiana's mother had recently suffered a minor accident, so Aaliyah wanted to spend a few days cheering them both up. She packed a small carry-on, wearing a bright yellow hoodie, comfortable leggings, and her favorite Nike sneakers. She arrived at O'Hare by rideshare, her father away in Silicon Valley for business. Franklin hated that he couldn't be there to see her off, but Aaliyah was used to traveling independently by then. With her father's unstoppable schedule, she had learned self-reliance early on. Yet even as she walked through the bustling corridors of O'Hare, a strange feeling settled in her stomach. She couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps it was her nervousness about Tiana's situation, or maybe the faint tension in the air. It seemed like the airport staff were on edge, dealing with a surge of summer travelers. Long lines, overbooked flights, and hectic announcements filled the atmosphere. Aaliyah found her gate C-29, headed to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. She settled into a seat near the window to wait. She put on her headphones and scrolled through her phone, checking on Tiana's messages. Pictures of her mother's cast jokes about Aaliyah's expected arrival, and instructions on what to bring if possible. She didn't notice when the gate attendants looked over at her for just a moment, or when a flight attendant walked around with hushed whispers. A handful of passengers were already lined up for early boarding families, with children, a few folks in wheelchairs, and a group of well-dressed business travelers. The overhead monitors indicated the flight was on time. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not yet. Aaliyah found comfort in flights, ironically, because they helped her see the world from a new perspective. She was a top student used to balancing her social life with academic rigor. Between debate club volunteering at a local children's charity and her advanced classes, she rarely found time to just exhale. Flying felt like an escape from her daily treadmill. She also faced the burdens that many black teenagers face, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle forms of racism. She had grown adept at brushing off the double takes from teachers who didn't expect her to excel, or from classmates who marveled that she lived in a mansion. She found ways to code switch, to adapt, to diffuse tension. Most of the time, she forced herself not to overthink it. Her father had taught her to pick her battles carefully. But that day, the tension in the airport felt a little sharper. She saw how some staff members glanced at her hoodie and carry-on with mild suspicion. She saw how a middle-aged man frowned at her for no apparent reason when she walked by. Usually she was able to ignore it, but maybe she was exhausted, worried for Tiana's mother, and traveling alone, her defenses felt slightly worn down. When the boarding call for Zone 1 was announced, Aaliyah rose with the rest of the passengers. She was in Zone 2, so she waited off to the side, giving the wheelchair users and families a wide berth. The flight attendants scanned tickets, and the line shuffled forward. A young flight attendant caught her eye for a moment, gave a polite nod, and resumed scanning boarding passes. Despite that gesture, a cold knot in Aaliyah's stomach refused to dissolve. She reminded herself that if anything went wrong, her father was just a phone call away. They had a family rule call if trouble arises. He might be halfway across the country, but Franklin Jackson never left her stranded. "Let's see," she whispered to herself, checking her phone for any final message from Tiana. Nope, everything's good. As soon as Zone 2 was called, she stepped up, scanned her boarding pass, and proceeded down the jet bridge. She offered a gentle smile to the flight attendant at the plane door, who returned it without much warmth. Aaliyah found her seat, 19A window seat. She stowed her carry-on in the overhead bin and settled in. She texted Tiana a quick message. "Boarded, see you soon," then switched her phone to airplane mode. Outside, the ground crew loaded luggage onto the plane. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered. Flight attendants shuffled up and down the aisle, guiding people to seats, verifying overhead bins had enough room, and reminding folks to store smaller bags under the seat. A mild sense of relief washed over Aaliyah. She was one step closer to seeing her cousin. The plane doors closed with a mechanical hiss. A smooth voice from the cockpit introduced the captain the route and the flight duration, approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes to Atlanta. Aaliyah turned her gaze to the window, watching the ground crew move away. Then came the safety demonstration performed meticulously by the flight attendants. Everything felt routine normal. Yet as soon as the plane pushed back from the gate, Aaliyah noticed something odd. A commotion was stirring a few rows behind her. It was subtle at first, just some raised voices. A man was complaining loudly that he needed more leg room. A flight attendant tried to appease him, apologizing, offering to check if there was another seat available. The engine hum intensified as the plane taxied. The overhead lights flickered again. An announcement came from the cockpit. "We'll be taking off shortly." But the complaining man's voice grew louder, carrying forward in the cabin. "This is unacceptable," he snapped. "Why should I be crammed in here like this?" Aaliyah glanced back. The man was older, wearing a collared shirt and dress pants with a briefcase under his seat. When his eyes darted around for a scapegoat, they landed unfortunately on Aaliyah. She instinctively turned back around, wanting no part in the conflict. After a few minutes, the flight attendants coaxed the man into another seat. The tension in the cabin deflated a little, but not entirely. Aaliyah put on her noise-cancelling headphones to drown out the residual grumbles. She stared out the window as the runway lights streaked by. Suddenly, the plane began to slow. An announcement from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a short delay on the runway. Air traffic control has indicated we need to wait a few minutes before takeoff." A collective groan rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nervously checked their watches, worried about missed connections. Aaliyah simply sighed. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered flight delays. She closed her eyes, hoping to relax. But tension escalated again when the complaining passenger had a second meltdown. He pressed the call button, summoning a flight attendant. "If we're going to be stuck here, I need some water," he demanded. The flight attendant calmly explained that service wouldn't start until after takeoff. "Don't give me that!" The man spat frustration, coloring his cheeks red. "I can't believe this incompetent staff." Aaliyah heard scuffling footsteps. Another attendant approached to see what the fuss was about. That's when she noticed the first strange thing directed at her personally. The flight attendant shot her a wary glance as though checking to see if she was causing any disruption. "We're sorry for the inconvenience," the attendant told the man in a measured tone. "We'll do our best to accommodate." Aaliyah felt the hair on her arms stand up. Why were they looking at her like that? She had stayed quiet, headphones on. Dismissing it as a random glance, she turned her gaze to the window again. Finally, air traffic control cleared them for takeoff, and the plane roared down the runway. Aaliyah's heart soared momentarily. She always found the force of takeoff exhilarating. The plane ascended, and Chicago's skyline shrank beneath the clouds. For a few moments, she was able to forget the commotion, letting the hum of the engine lull her into a sort of daydream. It started around 20 minutes into the flight. The seatbelt sign was still on because of mild turbulence. Flight attendants were hustling up and down the aisle, distributing water cups and snack bags. Aaliyah politely declined the snack, although she took a water cup, sipping slowly. She was listening to music through her headphones when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She removed one ear cup and looked up. A flight attendant stood there, her navy uniform crisp, a strained smile on her face. "Ma'am, can you come with me for a moment?" the attendant asked, voice tight. Confused, Aaliyah blinked. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Her mind raced. Was there an issue with her seat? Or had the complaining passenger singled her out for some reason? The flight attendant avoided eye contact. "We need to speak with you in the galley. Please gather your belongings." Her tone didn't suggest a choice. It was a demand. Heads in adjacent rows turned to watch. Aaliyah felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She slipped her phone into her pocket and carefully pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin. She followed the attendant down the aisle, navigating the stares of curious passengers. In the galley near the front of the plane, 2 flight attendants and a man wearing a pilot's uniform awaited her. The pilot had a stern expression. One flight attendant stepped forward. "We've received a complaint about disruptive behavior," she said plainly. Aaliyah's eyes went wide. "Wait, who, me?" "We have a passenger claiming you threatened him and were causing a disturbance," the pilot said gravely. "You used inappropriate language toward him." The words slammed into Aaliyah like a freight train. Shock battled with indignation. She recalled the rude passenger behind her. Could he have possibly blamed her for his meltdown? "That's not true," Aaliyah insisted, voice trembling. "I've been in my seat the whole time, headphones on. I didn't speak to anyone." One flight attendant glanced at her colleague uncertainly, but the pilot pressed on. "We're not going to debate this here. The passenger insists you made verbal threats. We have a responsibility to maintain safety on board." Aaliyah was stunned. She felt tears threaten, but she fought them back. "Sir, I promise I didn't threaten anyone. Check the other passengers. Check the cameras if you have them. This is a misunderstanding." The lead flight attendant shook her head. "We can't investigate mid-flight. The passenger is quite upset. He claims you used aggressive language, and we can't risk a confrontation at 35,000 feet. She hesitated before adding, We'll have to ask you to leave the flight at the next airport. That's insane. Aaliyah's voice trembled with disbelief. I swear I haven't said a word to him. This is racism, he's lying, and you're just taking his word for it because... She stopped herself, but the pilot's gaze darkened. Because what he prodded. In that moment, Aaliyah realized exactly what was happening. She wasn't being taken seriously. She was a black teenager wearing casual clothes. In the eyes of these crew members, the well-dressed middle-aged businessman must have seemed more credible. Her tears finally spilled over. This is so unfair, she whispered, voice choked. The flight attendants exchanged looks. One said quietly, Let's try to keep things calm. We'll be landing for a layover in Louisville in about 30 minutes. You'll have to disembark there. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. They were kicking her off the plane just like that. No proof, no second opinions, nothing. She felt a flash of rage, but also deep humiliation. She pictured her father's face, how disappointed he would be that she was being mistreated like this. She also felt fear swirling. She would be alone in a strange airport, forced to make new travel plans. Before she could protest further, the pilot signaled for her to hand over her boarding pass. Her heart pounded so loud, she thought the entire cabin could hear it. When we land in Louisville, you'll exit first, the pilot instructed. We'll arrange for airline staff to meet you at the gate. Aaliyah swallowed, her eyes stinging. She nodded shakily, uncertain what else to do. They escorted her back to her seat, instructing her to remain quiet. Other passengers watched as she returned, confusion on their faces. She couldn't bring herself to meet their eyes. She buried her face in her hands, tears soaking her palms. As the plane descended toward Louisville, Aaliyah's heart throbbed in dread. The humiliating walk to the front of the plane seemed surreal. She overheard some whispers. Why are they kicking that girl off? She didn't do anything. This is ridiculous. She realized not everyone believed the man's story. But the crew seemed resolute. When the wheels touched the tarmac in Louisville, the pilot made a terse announcement that a disruptive passenger would be deplaning. Aaliyah's cheeks burned at the label. She desperately wanted to defend herself, but she was too overwhelmed to speak. She cradled her carry-on, feeling small and ashamed. The flight attendants ushered her forward. The complaining passenger shot her a triumphant glare from his seat as she passed, arms folded over his chest. She wanted to shout at him, to call him out as a liar, but the words stuck in her throat. Every eye was on her as she made her way off the plane. At the gate, 2 airline representatives stood waiting. Their expressions were neutral, almost bored, as though dealing with a routine inconvenience. Aaliyah clutched her phone in her hand. She wanted to call her father immediately, but she forced herself to hold back until she was in a quieter space. "I'm sorry for the trouble," one representative said, though her tone lacked sincerity. "We'll book you on the next available flight to Atlanta or back to Chicago, whichever you prefer." Aaliyah stared at her in disbelief. "I didn't do anything. That man lied about me, threatening him. He was the one yelling at the flight attendants. Why am I being punished?" The representative gave a perfunctory shrug. "We can't comment on what happened in the cabin. The decision rests with the pilot." "Unbelievable," Aaliyah muttered. "I'll just get my own flight. Or I'll figure something out." The second representative, a stern-faced man, asked, "Are you unaccompanied?" She nodded. He sighed. "You're a minor, correct?" "I'm 17, almost 18, she clarified. "And I have resources. I'll handle my own transportation from here on." The representatives exchanged a look, perhaps relieved that they wouldn't have to deal with her further. They handed her a pamphlet about passenger rights that felt more insulting than helpful. With that, they walked away, leaving Aaliyah alone in the gate area. She let out a shaky breath and turned on her phone. Messages from Tiana. When you land. Everything okay? Aaliyah quickly typed a frantic update. Kicked off flight. We'll call in a minute. She noticed a missed call from her father, so she dialed him. Dad, she croaked when he answered. Hearing his steady voice made her burst into tears. She recounted the whole ordeal, voice trembling with anger and humiliation. She ended with a sob. I swear I didn't even talk to that passenger. They just believed him because of prejudice. Franklin finished for her voice low and furious. I'm so sorry, baby. Don't worry. I'm going to fix this right now. Where are you exactly, Louisville? The next flight to Atlanta isn't for another few hours. She sniffed, wiping her tears. Stay put, Franklin said firmly. I have a connection in Atlanta, ironically, but I can reroute. You said you're at Louisville, correct? Yes, Louisville International Airport. He paused, calculating. All right, I'm making a call. I'll update you in 10 minutes. Don't talk to anyone else from that airline, unless you have to. I promise I'll handle this. Exactly 7 minutes after hanging up, her phone buzzed. It was her father, change of plans. I'm sending the family's Gulfstream I-4. The pilot will be wheels up in 20 minutes from Chicago Executive Airport, headed your way. Aaliyah's heart soared with relief, though she still felt the sting of her humiliation. The thought of stepping onto her father's sleek private jet gave her a measure of justice, but she would have preferred never to need it. This entire fiasco was unnecessary. She found a quiet corner in the terminal, pacing as she tried to calm herself. She still wore her bright yellow hoodie, tear stains on the sleeves. She texted Tiana the update. I'm actually coming on Dad's jet. I'll explain everything when I land. Tiana replied with a flurry of angry and supportive emojis. As she waited, she noticed a few passengers from her original flight who had also deplaned in Louisville for connecting flights. Some recognized her shooting curious glances. One elderly woman approached hesitantly. Honey, I'm so sorry for what happened back there, she said quietly. That man was the troublemaker, not you. I couldn't believe how the crew handled it. Aaliyah swallowed the lump in her throat. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't do anything wrong, but nobody listened. The woman shook her head sympathetically. They never do. At least not always. But just keep your chin up. I hope you have a safe journey from here. That small gesture of kindness steadied Aaliyah. She gave a faint smile. Thank you so much. That means more than you know. Over the airport's loudspeaker announcements rattled on about arriving and departing flights. She checked her watch every few minutes. True to her father's word, half an hour later, she received a text message. Jet has landed at Signature Flight Support. I've arranged a courtesy car to pick you up from the main terminal. They will hold a sign with your name. And just like that, in the same airport where she had been dumped unceremoniously by the airline, her father's private Gulfstream 4 had arrived. A private car would shuttle her across the tarmac like visiting royalty. It was a dramatic shift. Aaliyah couldn't help feeling the poetic justice. But the humiliation still burned. She wanted the airline to answer for their actions. She made her way to the arrivals area, scanning for someone holding a sign. Sure enough, a well-dressed chauffeur with a placard reading A. Jackson waited by the elevators. He greeted her with polite professionalism. Ms. Jackson, right this way. She followed him outside, where a black SUV stood idling. The hush of tinted windows greeted her as she climbed into the back seat. Her phone buzzed again. Her father. She picked up. "I'm sorry, baby," he said gently. "I'm still in San Francisco. I can't be there personally for another day or two. But my co-pilot Mark knows you well. He'll make sure you get to Atlanta safely." Aaliyah exhaled slowly, some of her tension easing. "Thank you, Dad. I appreciate it. But what about that flight crew? They can't just get away with this." Her father's voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. "They won't. Trust me." Even as Aaliyah settled into the plush leather seat of the private jet, a storm was brewing on social media. The elderly woman from the flight, whose name she would later learn was Dorothy Baker, had posted a scathing account of what had happened. She wrote on Facebook, "Witnessed a heartbreaking act of racism on Flight 738 this afternoon. A polite young black girl was kicked off unfairly for something she never did. The real troublemaker was a rude man who complained from start to finish. The airline staff never questioned his story and believed him over her. Disgraceful. #stop racial. Profiling. The post went viral within hours. Hundreds, then thousands of shares rippled across the internet. Friends and family chimed in outraged. News outlets began picking up the story. Airline accused of racism after removing black teen from flight. Comment sections exploded with both support for the teen girl and condemnation of the airline. A few trolls tried to defend the airline or accuse the teen of wrongdoing, but the overwhelming majority expressed outrage. A local Louisville news station sent a reporter to the terminal, hoping to catch a word with the kicked-off teenager. But by that time, Aaliyah was already en route to Atlanta on her father's Gulfstream. The story gained even more momentum when someone recognized Franklin Jackson's name, connecting him to major tech achievements and philanthropic efforts. Well, that airline sure messed with the wrong family. Read one tweet. From her seat on the private jet, Aaliyah stared at her phone in disbelief as notifications poured in. She had posted a single sentence on her personal Instagram, "Unbelievable day." Kicked off a flight for no reason. Still reeling. That short post exploded with hundreds of comments of shock and support. Her direct messages filled up friends, classmates, even strangers offering words of solidarity. Aaliyah felt overwhelmed. She had never wanted or expected to be at the center of such a controversy. She told Tiana about it during an in-flight call. "There's a hashtag with your name on it," Tiana said. "Mad Justice for Aaliyah. People are losing their minds over this." Aaliyah let out a nervous laugh. "That's crazy." She paused, wiping her brow. "I mean, I'm glad people are outraged, but I never wanted to be the face of anything like this." Tiana's voice was gentle. "I know, cousin. But it happened, and maybe you'll help bring attention to how often this type of discrimination occurs." "You okay?" "Yeah," Aaliyah replied softly, her eyes drifting to the clouds outside. "I'll be okay." The private jet soared through clear skies. While shorter than a commercial flight, the trip still gave Aaliyah time to reflect. Her father's pilot, Mark, treated her kindly, offering snacks and drinks. He reassured her that Mr. Jackson would sort everything out. They landed at a private airfield near Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, ironically just minutes after her original commercial flight from which she'd been kicked off, arrived at the main terminal. Stepping onto the tarmac, Aaliyah felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Relief to see Tiana waiting for her with open arms, but anger at the memory of being singled out. Tiana pulled her into a hug. "Oh my God, I was so worried. Are you okay?" Aaliyah nodded, fighting back tears. She pressed her face into Tiana's shoulder. "I'm just glad to be here. Thank you for meeting me." They retrieved Aaliyah's bag from the jet and headed to Tiana's car. On the drive back to Tiana's home, the radio news station blared an update: local airline under fire for allegedly removing a teenage passenger based on a false accusation. Civil rights organizations have expressed interest in investigating potential discrimination. Aaliyah's stomach knotted. This was bigger than she realized. Tiana reached over and squeezed her hand. "Stay strong," she whispered. Back at Tiana's home, they found Tiana's mum resting her injured leg propped up on pillows. "My poor girl, come here," she said, opening her arms for a hug. "I can't believe they did that to you." Aaliyah forced a weak smile. "I'm okay, Auntie. How's your leg?" "It's healing," she replied, though it was clear her mind was on her niece's ordeal. "But we're going to talk more about your situation soon. People need to answer for this." Franklin Jackson remained in constant communication with Aaliyah by phone. He told her about the calls he'd received from journalists and lawyers. "I have a team looking into this," he said. "I don't want you to stress. Just focus on helping your cousin and aunt. I'll handle the rest." The airline, a mid-sized carrier with national roots, had initially tried to remain silent. But as the social media outcry escalated and mainstream news picked up the story, they were forced to address the controversy. Their corporate communications department released a brief statement. "We are aware of allegations regarding an incident on Flight 738. The safety and well-being of our passengers is our top priority. While we investigate, we ask for patience in understanding that decisions made by the flight crew are to ensure the comfort and safety of all on board." The statement was met with widespread criticism. "That's not an apology, that's a non-statement," read one comment. Civil rights groups turned up the heat, calling for the airline to fully investigate the racial bias in its ranks. Hashtags continued trending. Franklin Jackson, still in San Francisco, provided an on-the-record statement to a major news outlet. "My daughter was mistreated and humiliated without cause. This is bigger than just her story. It reflects systemic issues in our society. We demand a fair investigation and accountability." Behind the scenes, the airline scrambled. The flight crew who removed Aaliyah had to file incident reports. The complaining passenger, however, had gone silent, refusing to speak publicly, fueling suspicion that he had fabricated the story. Anonymous insiders leaked that the pilot and flight attendants were under internal review for potentially mishandling the situation. A few days later, a video emerged, shot by a fellow passenger, showing the complaining man's rant. In the footage, he never once interacted with Aaliyah. Instead, he was seen berating the flight attendants for legroom and water service. The camera angle, while shaky, offered clear audio. There was no mention of threats, no glimpse of Aaliyah saying a single word to him. Public opinion swung even more decisively in her favor. Now calls for the airline to name shame and discipline the guilty parties flooded social media. And then came the karmic twist. The airline's stock took a noticeable dip over the ensuing week. Rumors circulated about boycotts. Prominent black activists called for accountability and threatened to organize protests at major airports if the airline did not handle the situation properly. Ticket sales for that carrier reportedly decreased as travelers decided to avoid them. The airline's leadership found itself cornered, trying to manage a full-blown PR crisis. Franklin Jackson hired a civil rights attorney, renowned for handling discrimination cases. The lawsuit threatened to rock the airline. Journalists camped outside the Jackson estate in Chicago, clamoring for more interviews with Aaliyah. But Franklin insisted on letting the legal process take shape. Aaliyah, still in Atlanta, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, helping Tiana's mom around the house, going to the grocery store, ignoring the paparazzi who occasionally lurked outside. On a quiet Sunday morning, Aaliyah received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, but curiosity got the best of her. "Hello?" A trembling voice came from the other end. "Hi, my name is Bethany. I'm one of the flight attendants who was on Flight 738. Aaliyah froze, her pulse quickening. Bethany continued, voice laced with remorse. I wanted to say I'm so sorry about what happened to you. I never believed that man's story, but I was pressured by my supervisor to go along with the pilot's decision." Aaliyah's throat tightened. She had no idea how to respond. Why are you calling me?" she managed. Bethany sounded near tears. "Because I saw the truth, and I can't sleep at night knowing we did that to you. I understand if you hate me, but I wanted you to know the pilot didn't even consider your side. The passenger was in first class. They saw him as more important, and I'm sorry. We all are, actually. My friend Patricia, another flight attendant, also felt awful." Aaliyah closed her eyes, the swirl of emotions overwhelming. Part of her wanted to scream. Part of her felt some relief that not everyone on that crew had malicious intent. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered finally. Bethany inhaled shakily. "I'm talking to some lawyers too about giving a statement. I just can't keep quiet anymore. I'll do whatever I can to help." After the call ended, Aaliyah felt her heart pounding. She immediately relayed this conversation to her father, who asked for Bethany's contact details. He was cautious, but recognized how crucial it was to have a first-hand witness from the airline. If Bethany and her colleague were willing to testify, it could seal the case. Within a week, Bethany and Patricia had come forward, publicly releasing statements to a major news network. They detailed how the pilot had made up his mind the moment the passenger, who ironically was a frequent flyer with the airline, complained about Aaliyah. They added that the airline culture often encouraged staff to side with high-paying or high-status passengers, sometimes at the expense of fair treatment. The revelations caused a new wave of fury. More calls for boycotts and firmer action against the pilot rose from the public. The airline's CEO attempted a second statement, this time a vaguely worded apology that included mention of training improvements and policy reviews, but it was too little too late. The public wanted resignations and structural changes. Karma struck again when multiple large companies, noticing the wave of public sentiment, publicly announced that they would temporarily suspend travel with the airline for their employees. Their stock tumbled further. The pilot was suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. The flight attendants who refused to stand up for Aaliyah were put on administrative leave. Bethany and Patricia, ironically, were also suspended, albeit for sharing internal information, but the public saw them as whistleblowers. A legal fund was set up for them by supportive strangers online. Every day, more news outlets replayed the video of the complaining passenger's meltdown. Reporters dug into his background. He was a small-time businessman with a prior record of filing frivolous lawsuits. He refused all interview requests, presumably hiding from public backlash. Meanwhile, Aaliyah's father pressed forward with the lawsuit, seeking not just monetary compensation, but also mandatory changes in the airline's policies, better training to combat discrimination, and formal apologies from all involved staff. The airline's lawyers tried to settle, but Franklin stood firm. "We're not interested in sweeping this under the rug," he declared. "This has to be public. People need to know." Media coverage soared. Interview requests poured in. Aaliyah did her best to stay out of the spotlight, focusing on her cousin's family. Yet the entire affair had exploded into a national conversation on racial profiling in the airline industry. Activists seized the moment to highlight how common it was for black passengers to be singled out for small or non-existent infractions. Bloggers posted personal testimonies. High-profile celebrities tweeted in support of Aaliyah. An "I Stand with Aaliyah" movement gained momentum online, with influencers filming videos about their own experiences or telling watchers how they too could stand up for passenger rights. The entire conversation became about more than just one teenage girl. It grew into a broader push for accountability in the airline business. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic reigned. Board members pressured the CEO to address the scandal decisively. The marketing department lamented that no PR spin could quell the outcry. Meanwhile, the pilot in question, identified as Captain Randall Moore, attempted to defend his decision, claiming he had only followed standard security protocols. That statement only fanned the flames. People demanded to see these standard protocols that apparently allowed an innocent teenager to be ejected from a flight without evidence. At a heavily attended press conference, one journalist grilled the airline's spokesperson. "Is it standard procedure to expel minor black passengers based solely on hearsay from a man throwing a tantrum?" The spokesperson stammered, unable to provide a coherent answer. The press hammered the airline relentlessly. In the court of public opinion, they were already guilty. While the storm raged around her, Aaliyah struggled with her own emotional fallout. She had nightmares about being confronted by authority figures who refused to believe her. In quiet moments, the sense of humiliation resurfaced. Tiana urged her to see a therapist, which Aaliyah initially resisted. She didn't want to acknowledge how deeply the incident had affected her. But after a gentle nudge from her father, she agreed to talk to someone. Friends and neighbors rallied around her family. A local Atlanta youth group invited Aaliyah to speak about her experience and encourage young people to advocate for themselves. She hesitated. Speaking publicly felt daunting. But eventually she accepted, motivated by the idea that her story might help someone else avoid a similar nightmare. When she went to the youth group meeting, the warm reception overwhelmed her. A standing ovation greeted her as she walked in. She was just a teenager, but the crowd treated her like a hero. Her voice shaky, she recounted how it all happened, how quickly her rights were stripped away, how powerless she felt. "We have to speak out," she told them. "We have to tell the truth every time this happens. So maybe one day, it won't happen anymore." Her short speech circulated on social media. More doors opened. Journalists, talk show hosts. She even got invited to do a short segment on a nationally televised morning show. Though she was nervous, she decided to use her platform to push for change. "I'm not an activist by trade," she told the host. "I'm just a teenager who wanted to visit her cousin. But if my story can help fix something broken, then I'm all for it." Months passed, and the lawsuit wove its way through the legal system. The airline attempted private mediation multiple times, hoping to avoid a public trial. Franklin Jackson and his legal team attended these sessions, but they refused to be silenced. They demanded not only financial restitution for emotional distress, but also a binding agreement that the airline overhaul its training programs and adopt stricter guidelines against discrimination. Behind closed doors, the airline's lawyers tried to pressure Franklin to accept a sizable settlement. This is a fair offer, they argued. Think about your daughter. She can move on from this. Franklin's face was carved in granite. She's strong enough to handle the truth in public, he said coolly. No amount of money will fix systemic bias. We want structural reforms written into the settlement. That's non-negotiable. The tension was palpable. The airline's lawyers realized they were up against not just a wealthy man, but someone who had moral conviction on his side, a man who had grown up with nothing and was not afraid of a fight. They also realized the risk of continuing a very public feud that battered their client's reputation daily, so they grudgingly agreed to some of the demands. Still, negotiations dragged on. The pilots' union got involved, muddying the waters. Some union reps believed the airline was scapegoating the pilot, while the airline claimed it was solely his call. Regardless, public sympathy remained firmly with Aaliyah. At length, an arrangement was hammered out, financial damages for emotional distress. A formal and public apology from the airline, the firing of Captain Moore, and new mandatory anti-discrimination training for all cabin crews and gate staff. The airline also pledged to adopt a stricter complaint verification process before removing any passenger in the future. The deal was hammered into a legal document with input from civil rights organizations who declared it a potential blueprint for the airline industry going forward. The air in the press conference room was electric with tension. Rows of journalists filled the seats, cameras mounted on tripods, blinking red, broadcasting live feeds to every major news outlet. On the raised stage at the front of the hall sat 2 tables, one the airline executives, the other for the Jackson family and their legal team. Microphones clustered like metal flowers, capturing every breath, every pause. Aaliyah sat between her father and their attorney, dressed in a sleek navy blazer and crisp white blouse. Her braids were pulled back neatly, and though she smiled faintly for the cameras, her eyes remained solemn. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. Her father, Franklin Jackson, exuded quiet command as he adjusted the microphone in front of him. To his right sat the airline's CEO, a pale, visibly exhausted man in a suit that seemed to hang too heavily on his frame. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Today we acknowledge a grave error," the CEO began. "On Flight 738, our crew mishandled a situation that led to the removal of Ms. Aaliyah Jackson, without cause, without proper verification, and without fairness. We apologize unequivocally for the distress this caused her, her family, and our community." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. The phrase "without cause" was more than a legal admission. It was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a public confession. Our internal investigation, the CEO continued, revealed failures in protocol and lapses in judgment. Bias, unconscious or otherwise, was at play. We accept responsibility and pledge corrective action. He turned slightly and handed a signed document to Franklin. The moment was choreographed, but the impact was real. Franklin accepted it without expression, placing it gently in front of him. Then it was his turn to speak. "Thank you." Franklin began, his voice low but unwavering. "This journey began with a phone call no parent should ever have to receive from a daughter in tears, humiliated and stranded. But it ends here, not with silence or money, but with accountability." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "What happened to Aaliyah is part of a broader issue," he continued. We didn't pursue legal action for headlines or payback. We pursued it to ensure that no child, no passenger faces this kind of injustice again. Aaliyah, her hand trembling slightly, reached for the microphone. She took a deep breath. I was scared, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I was alone and confused. I thought if I stayed calm, if I followed the rules, I'd be okay. But it didn't matter. They didn't listen. She paused, the memory still sharp. But so many people did. Strangers, friends, even some of the flight crew later came forward. I'm grateful. And I hope what we've done today makes a difference. The crowd burst into applause, not raucous, but sustained and respectful. Reporters raised their hands. Flashes went off like strobe lights, but Franklin nodded once to their legal counsel, signaling the end of their public comments. Later away from the stage, Franklin spoke to a small group of reporters off camera. The financial terms of this settlement will remain private, he said, but I will say this, a significant portion will go to advocacy groups focused on equity in air travel. We've also created a fund in Aaliyah's name to support youth programs that teach legal literacy and civil rights. He looked over at his daughter, who was speaking softly to a journalist from Teen Vogue. She's stronger than I ever imagined. Meanwhile, behind closed doors at the airline's headquarters, staff reviewed the formal policy changes now etched into company procedure. Mandatory anti-bias training, new chain of command protocols, enhanced verification steps for any complaint against a minor. And most critically, a passenger advocate position created on every flight whose job was to mediate disputes with fairness, not hierarchy. The public saw the apology and the signatures. What they didn't see was the reckoning inside the airline board members, demanding resignations, HR departments, scrambling to issue new guidelines, marketing teams drawing up redemption campaigns. But for Aaliyah, the most meaningful moment came not in front of cameras, but later that evening. They returned to their Chicago estate in silence, both too emotionally drained to speak. Aaliyah walked into her room, dropped her bag, and stood at the window overlooking the manicured gardens. The summer sun was beginning to set, casting a golden wash over the trees. Her father knocked once before entering. "You okay? I think so," she said. "But it doesn't feel over." Franklin nodded. "It's not. Not really. But we made it farther than most people ever get." She turned to face him. "What if it happens to someone else, and they don't have a dad with a jet or $1 million lawyer?" "Then we fight for them too," Franklin said. "That's the whole point." She hugged him, then holding tight. The room, the house, even the media storm beyond all of it, fell away for a moment. There was only a father and his daughter, finally reclaiming their peace. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and somewhere across the country, a teenage girl boarded a flight, her ticket scanned by a better-trained staff. Her journey made safer because of Aaliyah. Following the public apology, the pilot was fired and faced potential legal action from the airline for misrepresenting events. While it remained unclear if he would face direct criminal charges, his professional reputation was in tatters. The complaining passenger found himself under intense scrutiny, his face plastered across social media as a liar who triggered a national scandal. Anonymous sources claimed he lost business clients who refused to work with someone so blatantly dishonest. Thus, both the pilot and that passenger faced their own forms of karma. The flight attendants who stayed silent found themselves re-evaluating their careers and moral compasses, some resigning due to guilt or public scorn. As for Aaliyah, she returned to her life, albeit forever changed. She decided to finish high school in Chicago, joining new clubs focused on social justice. With her father's resources and support, she used her unexpected platform to speak at events about systemic bias, encouraging young people to document their experiences and stand up for what was right. She continued therapy sessions, slowly regaining her confidence when traveling. One day, months after the scandal's peak, Aaliyah boarded a commercial flight with her father by her side. They chose not to rely on the private jet this time. She felt her stomach flutter nervously, but as she took her seat, her father gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Look at how far you've come," he whispered. A kindly flight attendant recognized them and offered warm greetings. "So glad to have you both on board. Is there anything you need?" Her smile was genuine, her tone respectful. Aaliyah smiled back. "No, I'm fine," she said, exhaling relief. The nightmares were subsiding, replaced by cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change one flight at a time. And so ended the chapter of the scandal that began as a humiliating removal from a plane. The story lingered in public consciousness, a cautionary tale about prejudice, power, and consequences. It also stood as proof that with courage, persistence, and a bit of serendipity, justice could be served. For Aaliyah, it would always be a turning point in her life, a testament to the truth that out of the darkest injustices, light could still emerge. Conclusion. Approx. 150 words. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, one that began with a terrible injustice and ended with long overdue accountability. Aaliyah's story reminds us that it only takes a single moment of courage to spark a movement for change. It also proves that even the most powerful institutions can be held to account when faced with undeniable truths and collective outrage. Now it's your turn to make a difference. If this story moved you, if it inspired you to stand up for what's right, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on injustice and resilience. Together, let's build a world where kindness triumphs over prejudice and where no teenager has to endure what Aaliyah faced on that fateful flight. Thank you for watching.